Thank you for that song and the reminder of the sacredness of our planet. Today I'd like to begin by reading some passages from one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches called Beyond Vietnam. I had a preaching professor when I was studying at BU, School of Theology, who said that Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail should be included in the Bible as, the next book in the Bible. I took that very seriously. I was really taking notes. And so some of King's speeches have become for me sacred scriptures that I turn to. And these are some excerpts from his speech, which he gave at the Riverside Church when he was finally deciding that he would speak out against the Vietnam War. But his words really are so powerful to consider today for Earth Day and the issues we're facing. And I invite you to listen and invite you to really find your own meaning as we're hearing these words. These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, people are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. A genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to humankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all humanity. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. We can no longer afford to worship the god of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. We have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. And today I want to build on these words that mean so much to me and to so many thousands of other people. And I want to start by celebrating the work in our community. For example, what Debbie shared about her work on multiple levels: international, national, state, regional, local. I think Pat couldn't make it today, but he's another activist in the community who has advanced environmental causes and works to actually clean up trash on the sides of the road and garden and do things like that. I also want to lift up, because today a big part of my talk is going to be about that intersection of racism and the environment that Debbie mentioned when she said, hey, on the Framingham page of their Eco Framingham, you see Black Lives Matter, and they have a link describing the connections. So that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to lift up the fact that we have a racial justice book group that's been studying My Grandmother's Hands and other books and has been opening our minds. We've had a racial justice dialogue going for maybe the last 7-8 years every month. And I'm also celebrating the work of many of our members in the local Black Lives Matter movement and other initiatives like that to transform the way our society works and the way we think and feel, because racism really lives within us. And one of the reasons, or one of kind of like the illuminations, in one of my previous talks, maybe about a month or so ago, I talked about how COVID has really opened up a space for us as a nation to explore this problem of racism. And if we look at it more, if we look at COVID, it's not just that we've seen, for example, the dramatic police violence, which we have and we've noticed more, for example, of George Floyd with, a knee on his neck saying, "I can't breathe." But we've also seen that kind of violence, not in the most direct and dramatic, but in the COVID numbers. If you look at the COVID death rate, if you look at the rate of infection, the communities that have been hit hardest by COVID are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So there's this, why would that be? And why would people of color, why would Black people or Indigenous people have a higher rate of COVID, sometimes dramatically higher, a higher death rate, as much as maybe 2 or 3 times as high? Well, one of the reasons is because of something that's called environmental racism. So if you're living in a Black community, it's much more likely that you're going to be, because of the way segregation works, placed in a community that's near an incinerator, that's near high pollution industries, that wouldn't be cited in a white majority area. And so you're going to be exposed to all this fine particulate matter in the air. It's give you diseases of the lung and the heart, and in general make you much more susceptible to getting COVID and maybe dying from COVID. Same with Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have an even higher rate of being sited next to polluting projects and projects that cause environmental harm to the people in the area. And so the cancer rate, for example, amongst the Indigenous community is higher than any other population in this country. So we see that there are these patterns of environmental racism, and then there's also another kind of violence. You could just call it poverty. Poverty is a kind of daily, slow killer, because when you're living in poverty, your stress level's much higher. It's terrible for your health. It takes years off your life. And in our country, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are much more likely to be poor, and are therefore, when this virus has, gone through the country, the effects have not been equal at all. Those who have more privilege and who have healthier environments to live in and who have better access to healthy food are doing much better, who have better access to healthcare. All those advantages then finally boil down to whether you live or whether you die. And it's dramatized, through this outbreak of COVID. And it's not just our community, but thousands of communities, faith communities around the country today are intentionally highlighting this problem, because it's something we feel, myself and many other clergy colleagues feel like we have a duty to raise awareness and we have a duty to elevate this conversation because the way our society is set up, it's just so easy to stay within our comfort zones. And when King talks about the fierce urgency of now, there's no way to experience that if we stay within the comfort zone that our society provides. Now, I'm only speaking for myself as a person because I can't really speak on behalf of everyone's experience. I'm only really speaking in a limited sense because I am a white man, so my experience of comfort is not the same as what others are experiencing. But basically, for example, segregation allows us, people to live in areas around people that have a similar racial demographic, who have a similar amount of money. It allows kind of like problems like the pollution, poverty to be existed in other physical space. And then the structures of racism, how they exist in our minds, allow us to not really see past what's happening to people across that mental divide that's created. It allows us to insulate ourselves from the suffering of others. And that insulation cuts us off from a sense of urgency and a sense of connection with the problems that are happening in our world. But it takes a certain amount of courage to deconstruct the barriers. It takes a certain amount of courage to open our eyes and to be willing to find out what's really going on in our community. For example, let's say you're a white-collar worker during COVID and you didn't lose your job and now you're working from home and you're thinking, I'm not being hit hard by COVID and I've got some extra stimulus money and I'm doing okay. It's still exhausting, it's still fatiguing, it's still isolating. But you might not be directly aware that poverty is dramatically on the rise. Because for those who work in frontline service industries, who have lost their jobs, for the undocumented people in our country who don't have access to unemployment, for so many families, poverty is now a much more prevalent problem. Even in our local area, when we started to do some research to get involved with service and we reached out to a place to turn and we reached out to the Native Service Council, they all told us they've never had this many cases in the recent past. They've never had so many families reaching out, so many families who, for example, that's why we're doing the diaper drive, who can't afford diapers. So they'll be reusing their diapers, or they'll be, delaying the diaper change. And that poverty rate, there are ways that it could be completely invisible. And if you don't choose to step into knowing, you don't have to know. We can go through our day and be unaware of the suffering that's out there. Or we can choose to really be open and really be aware of the suffering around us. And that, I think, is a major decision point to make or not to make. Are we going to choose to be more aware, or are we going to choose to be less aware? It's very discomforting to go into the higher level of awareness. I know it is for me, because then it makes me feel a lot of pressure to change my life, feel a lot of pressure to do something more. And that is a struggle. That is a major struggle. We've been involved with this whole question, for example, of trying to heal the divide between people who have different political views. That's been a huge step out of my personal comfort zone, because I've been so much more used to being in a progressive bubble. But trying to step out of that, and then try to say, well, what about being friends with people who disagree with me and working together, that's a huge step out of my comfort zone. And then it's interesting, one of the things I've noticed in this conversation is we'll go from something like we'll say, well, let's not just think of ourselves as progressive or conservative. Let's think of ourselves as being all Americans. Can we get to saying we're all Americans, and can we include that in our sphere? So it's like, that feels big because you're going from like, okay, like I only relate with progressives or I only relate with conservatives, and now you're saying like all Americans, and like take that boundary off, start caring about those people on the other side. Well, that feels like the floodgates are open. If I do that, that feels scary. King is saying in his speech, he says, well, we need a love for all humankind, so loving all Americans isn't good enough. That won't help you with some problem like the Vietnam War. If you just love all Americans, what about the Vietnamese? Well, if you just love all Americans, you're never going to make progress with climate change, because the nations hit hardest might not be the U.S. It might be other nations that are hit hardest. So King is saying we need to go to all humankind. That's a big stretch. That includes the communists, and that includes, the uncivilized people in other countries that we look down on every day and that feed our superiority complex. How are we going to do that? What about all the immigrants we hate, try to block out of the country so that they can't take our jobs? Well, that's a big stretch now. So that's a big stretch. Feels like kind of scary. I think we need to take it a little bit further than that. It can't just be people either. Can't just be people. Love has to go beyond that. You can't just love all people but wantonly torture and kill animals in factory farms. You could, but it's just leaving a little barrier where hate and disregard of life can live within you. So we want to expand it. We want to have a love for being in general, for all life forms, for animals, for sea life, for plants. We want to have a complete love for life. That's really what we want to cultivate. Whereas within us, the way we are given a mindset in our society allows us to have a very narrow love with all these barriers and walls where hate can live within our psyche, unaware, unconscious. And those places where hate lives, that is where we allow suffering to go on. We allow suffering to go on without regard for life. And it's not an active hate always. When we come to racism, people say, well, I'm not. White people are always saying, I'm not racist. I'm not actively, hatefully racist. No, we're not. We're passively racist. We're unaware. We have a barrier. And within ourselves, we're not aware of a passive hate that lives. But then when it gets touched, we recoil. You could be, I'm not a racist. I just go back 50 years ago. I'm not a racist. Segregation is just what we need. But I'm not racist. And then someone says, well, we're going to do busing and and they're, oh, I'm not racist, but I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with integration. That's radical. So these are the places where still within ourselves hate lives. And when it comes to activism, when it comes to environmental activism, the hate and the ignorance, I feel like they all live together, if this makes sense. When the environmental movement began with 350, for example, it was all wealthier white people starting this movement, turning on to the science of climate and saying, we understand how we can fix this. We'll stop burning fossil fuels and start planting more trees and balance this thing out. Solar power. It was like a math equation. And then the activists came into the world and they were like, hey, why aren't we fixing this problem right away? And then they realized, oh, it's because of injustice and how injustice operates and how the government's corrupt and all these other problems. And they're like, oh my goodness, we're fighting against the same kind of system that black people are fighting against, oppressing them. And but if you have these barriers and these walls all set up in your consciousness, you won't be able to make the connections. You're so turned off to dealing with racism within the white bubble, you're not going to be able to collaborate with the black activists. You're not going to be able to see what the indigenous people are going through. So it took a while for white activists to begin to understand, well, we have to break down these barriers. We have to be able to see the big picture, see how different forms of injustice overlap in the world so that we can work together and see a holistic vision for how our world needs to be transformed. So it's not just a technical solution to the problem of climate. It's not just a matter of some scientific equations and some new technology, because you find out, oh, it's a matter of indifference. It's a matter of greed. It's a matter of disregard for life. And so it's a revolutionary matter. It can only be solved through a revolution of values. It can only be solved through the turning from hate to love. It can only be solved through this more expansive sense of urgency. And so I believe that as a community, we say we are a love-centered community. I believe that that love has to have some urgency to it. And I believe that that love has to have some courage to it. And I believe that it has to be pushing us out of our comfort zones and pushing us to go beyond these boundaries that keep our eyes shut and don't allow us to touch the suffering in our world. And in so many ways, our community is really embodying, I do believe we are embodying this kind of love. It is, on the one hand, a comforting love. It's a love that brings us together, and it's a love that really does push us out of our comfort zones into different fields of activism and into different fields of making a difference in our lives. And I believe that as a community, when we have this commitment, when we're not just, working on our own individually, but when we come together, we're cultivating a way bigger commitment to a life-sustaining world, to a world that is fair and balanced. And the commitment is way more powerful. If you have 5 people on the same commitment, if you have 20, if you have 50, the power of that grows much more than just by the sheer, number of added units. It becomes a symbiotic kind of team process. One of the metaphors I love that I found from some colleagues in the work that reconnects is this metaphor of goose leadership, where you have a flock of geese. They make the V, and the V really, allows for the kind of the birds to share in the work of cutting through the air and cutting through the resistance. And, they're flying in each other's paths. And when the goose at the front gets tired, because it's very hard to be at the front, you're cutting through resistance. That goose circles back, another goose goes in front. And so, they're working together and sharing the stress and the strain. And in a community like ours, some of us are moving in different directions, or some of us at different times are at the cutting edge, really experiencing new learning, having breakthroughs, stretching ourselves by taking that 5 hours of flex time we may have and pouring it into an activist effort. Or maybe sometime it's like 10 hours. You're like, wow, I'm doing a lot with this free time that I have. But that's the goose leadership. And then another time you'd be like, I'm exhausted, I'm sick, I'm not doing anything with my activism right now. I'm just taking care of myself. That's the best I could do. Well, then someone else is in the lead. And so as a community, we're moving forward even when one member has to say, I need a break. I can't keep up with this. Or when we fail spectacularly by saying, hey, I just put 20 or 30 hours behind this effort and it just collapsed. Like a deck of cards, even though I thought this would be the thing that would begin to turn the tide, in the state or locally. That's the nature of what we try to do, because we're sometimes making new paths. We're making the new paths that other people are going to walk down. We're not always just walking down some easy path, because we feel like we need to change our world. We don't need to just be following the conventional pathways of our society's lifestyle. We need to be forging new directions. And that is work that we're doing together. So, as was mentioned earlier, like when Debbie shared, so key for our community. We need to build relationships with each other. We really need to have trust. We have to have communication. We have to have a baseline really of acceptance and togetherness. Doesn't mean we're going to become a complacent kind of community in that sense, like just a club. But the idea is when we build relationships and when we have trust, then we're going to see ourselves be able to operate together, to support each other, to bring our shared values into the center of what we're doing, and then actually operationalize those. It's actually amazing to see, but sometimes you really have to become friends with someone on some level before you can be able to do this challenging work. I mean, how many of us have been in school and you're getting the group project? Oh, the group project, the dreaded group project. No one wants the group project, right? Everyone wants to just write their own paper. Now I have to write a paper with 5 people. It's impossible. We'll never get it done on time. And so our community is a place where this is one of the beauty of love-centered as our highest value. Yes, we challenge each other to love each other, which can be difficult because not every personality just meshes like right away. It takes work and it takes commitment to be able to work as a team. I see it happening all over the community, and I would say the best things that we've done have been with teams, small teams. It's normally like 3 people, 5 people. They get so much done, and they are transforming our community and transforming their own lives. Finally, I'd just like to say that we do need to have a hope. We need to have a sense of urgency. When you look at the environmental crisis, when you look at the crisis of racial injustice and poverty in our country, if you're really paying attention, they're not things that you could wait on. They're not things that can be done later, especially when you're looking at a problem like climate. Can't wait. Needs to be done. Needs to be done now. If you're looking at a problem like violence in our world, structural poverty, is there any sense of waiting with that? There's no sense to wait. Everything needs to be done now. Everything needs to be done in the moment. When we touch the moment, it has its own urgency. You don't have to get it from anywhere else. Just get in touch with the problems around us. They are urgent. And then we need to support each other so we don't burn out when we're touching those problems, because it's a lot to process. It's not that sheltered. We need to be supporting each other just to stay open to process and to stay in the work in a way that isn't cynical. When we resign to the way things are, when we say, oh, we'll just let greed and hatred win the day. Well, that is it's too cynical a way to live. And the barriers we have to put up within ourselves to live within accepting that cynicism just really crush our spirits. We want to live as people of hope. We want to believe in the power of love, that love will win the day, that truth will win the day, that what is right will be established. That is such an open posture to life, and it's a hard pose to hold, and it's one that we try to cultivate and work together to do. I love our community. I feel that we come together with a very vibrant intention. We do our best, and we are choosing love. We're choosing to be courageous. We're choosing to open our minds more, connect more with people around us, build a more diverse community, embrace the challenges of community by learning to love each other and cooperate. And these are the things This is the spirit of urgency. And as we are a community of love, I want us to be a community of urgent love. A love that has some punch to it, some courage to it, and some passion to it. And that's my calling today on Earth Day, to love our earth, to open our minds more, to see how people of color, black people, indigenous people, are being disregarded and treated unjustly, to see that people and planet are one. The people who breathe the air and the air, that is all one, as Laura was teaching us. The people who drink the water and the water they drink, that's all one. That's all one. The planet will never be saved unless people are treated fairly and with human dignity. If people aren't regarded as sacred, the planet won't be regarded as sacred. And if the planet isn't regarded as sacred, people will never be regarded as sacred. And we cannot forget about animals as well, and all living beings. So let's have a love that's growing, let's have a love that's expanding, and let's have a love that is moving us with a sense of urgency.